Good afternoon. So this is our fourth lecture of Development and Growth 2. And in this lecture, we're going to look at the population and labor force issues. Let me share my screen and quickly jump to the discussion. Okay, so up to this point, we studied the facts of growth, right? And then we so let me recap. So first we looked at the facts, then we developed a particular framework that we're going to use to understand economic growth, and in the rest of the semester we are extending this framework. Then we looked at capital accumulation, right? So that part was about the simple solo model and the physical capital, more specifically. Okay, and today we're gonna look at the labor and population issues, right? Labor force and population issues. So in that respect, we are still using this production function approach. Okay, so here, as you remember, this is output, right? This is physical capital. And now we're going to discuss labor. Now, when we write the production function in this way, so maybe I can explain this. So first, there is population, right? Population of people aged over 0 to 100 plus, right? There are many people in the economy. Then there is what we call working age population. Okay, and working age population is typically 15 to 64. Okay, there's of course many people who are older than 64 and still working, and there are people who may be less than 15, I mean younger than the 15 years of age, but still working. But typically the working age population is between 15 and 64 years of age. Then we have the labor force, right? Now you could be, you could be in your working age years, but you may be in education, you may be disabled, etc., etc., right? So there could be many reasons that you may not be in the labor force. Then we have employment. So as you see, we have this, let's say segregated definition, or the subsets of different groups in the economy. So when I write L, maybe we can use this. So E could be employment, L could be labor force, right? This could be working age population, and this could be, let's say, population, right? So we want to understand how employment matters for production, right? So you may actually define these ratios, right? So first you can define the ratio of working age population in the population, right? Then you can define labor force within the working age population. Then you may define employment as a fraction of labor force, right? Now, as you see, so these terms and these terms would be canceled out, and we would be at the end imagining, how many people in the economy, right? So Turkish population, let's say, is 80-something million. Out of this 80-something million, let's say 30 million is employed, something like that, right? Or 25 million is employed, or something like that. So there is that view of the population and labor force. And then, of course, we may want to think about these ratios, right? So how many people in the society are in the working age? How many people who are in the working age years are actually in the labor force, so they are looking for a job or they are employed? And then at the end, so we can look at whether they are actually employed or they remain unemployed, right? So each of these factors would be affected by several stuff. Now, obviously, this is affected mainly by the demographic processes, right? So demography enters here. Education mostly enters in that part, right? Because people, but also again, demographic choices as well, because some people get married and remain out of the labor force. And then this part depends on the structure and many other things, right? So the demand can be, so there could be many factors that determines that determine how many people within the labor force would actually be employed. Okay. So now we're going to start with demography here. So to start with demography, we want to understand first the law of population, right? So how population changes. Now, obviously, there are three processes. So if P is population, right? So this is change in population. Let's say T is in years, okay? So it is discrete, okay? So change in population could be because there are births, okay? Then there are deaths, and then there is net migration, right? So if we accept people to the country, and on the net terms, if it is larger than the people who leave the country, the number of the people who leave the country, then there's net immigration. So that would also increase, of course, population. Okay. Now, you may imagine this increase in terms of ratios as well, right? So if you define population growth rate, right? So this is now the growth rate of population, right? By definition. So you may see some crude rates. Okay, so these are some crude rates. Okay, so what is that rate? So that's some definition of what we call the crude birth rate. Okay, and this is what we call the crude death rate, and this is the rate of immigration. So so how many births per person actually occur in an economy? How many deaths per person occur in an economy? And what is the net immigration relative to the existing population in the country? So these three ratios then determine the growth rate of population. Okay. So let's start with births. Okay. So when we talk about births, other than the crude birth rate, which we already defined, we look at a particular ratio, a particular indicator, which is called total fertility rate. Okay, total fertility rate, and we use this abbreviation for total fertility rate, or total fertility ratio, I'm sorry. Okay, this will be total fertility ratio. Now, what is that? Well, or total fertility rate. I'm totally confused now. I think it's total fertility rate. Okay. Sorry, I as a specialist in this field, I shouldn't be confused, but it's because of the, in the meantime, I was thinking about the Turkish translation. But anyhow, yes, it's total fertility rate. So what is that? Well, it has two versions. One is the cohort version, and the other, so cohort TFR, and the other is period TFR. Basically, we want to understand the total, some sort of average number of children per woman. Okay, children per woman in the economy. All right, and of course, by women, what we mean is women in their fertile ages, right? So it's usually 15 to 49. All right, so these are the or 15 to 45 in some definitions. Now the cohort fertility rate looks at fertilities that are completed. Fertility, so it is looking at completed fertility, right? So it looks at women aged over, let's say 49, right? Because we want to count how many kids they actually had. All right, and beyond this age, we are not really interested whether they have births or not, because this is an average anyhow, right? And in the period TFR, okay, in the period TFR, we want to look at the current situation, okay? The current fertility situation in the country. So for this reason, we want to look at, let's say 15 to 49, all right? So we want to look at these women, and we assume, okay, suppose that the woman is at 34 years old, right? A particular woman. So we're going to assume that until the age of 49, she's going to continue to follow the country's average fertility patterns. Okay. Then there's, let's say, another woman at, let's say 25. We're going to also assume that until the age of 49, she's going to also follow the typical pattern in the country. All right, typical fertility pattern in the country. Then we take that average and we find, once again, a measure of children per woman. Okay, the number of kids per woman. And interestingly, that particular indicator, total fertility rate, either you look at as a period fertility rate or cohort fertility rate. So it has, in time, it is like this, or so I'm of course drawing the general pattern, or something like this. Right? So more generally, you may see that there are some fluctuations and like this. All right. What is important here is this. So when a country develops, okay, when a country gets richer and richer, total fertility rate decreases. So this is called fertility transition. Okay, and there are many different causes of fertility transition that we will discuss. Okay, so keep in mind that. So we're gonna come back to the fertility transition and understand why a country, when it gets richer and richer, fertility decreases in that country. Okay. Now let's talk about mortality. For mortality, we typically look at 3 different indicators. Okay, one is life expectancy at birth. Okay, life expectancy at birth. It is sometimes denoted by this symbol. Okay, The other is infant mortality rate. Okay, so how many babies actually survive to 1 year of age, and the other is child mortality rate. And of course, you can define child mortality rate in different ways. Typically, we look at under 5 mortality. Okay, and what we see in the data, and of course, other than this, we also have crude death rate, right? We already discussed that. So it is death over, so total deaths divided by total population. So interestingly, we also see a mortality revolution, right? So let's say this is IMR and this is CMR, okay, child mortality rate. So these mortality rates, CMR, let's say IMR, they also exhibit decreasing patterns, okay? They also exhibit decreasing patterns when the country develops, okay? And of course, consistent with that, life expectancy at birth for different cohorts, let's say, it, for instance, increases, right? Starting at, say, I don't know, 40, it arrives at, let's say, 85, okay? So when countries develop, mortality rates decrease and life expectancy at birth increases, right? So then there must be some pattern of population growth rate. So for now, let's suppose that we assume immigration is 0. So net immigration would be 0, right? So there's no change because of immigration or emigration. Then we must have some understanding of the population growth rate, right? Because remember, population growth rate depends on the birth rate and the death rate. So here I'm assuming that net immigration is 0, okay? And these birth and death indicators have a particular shape in history, all right? Demographers developed this nice theory that is called demographic transition, okay? And they realized, okay, so fertility will decrease, right? And mortality will also decrease, okay? Now they realized historically, so this is your, let's say, fertility measure, okay? And this is your, let's say, mortality measure. So the difference between them, of course, gives you what? It gives you the population growth rate, okay? And then when a country gets richer, population growth rate has this bell-shaped pattern, okay? So that would be your population growth rate, okay? Now so this is, of course, a historically motivated theory, right? So history plays a large role in developing this theory because what we observe is that mortality transition in many countries, and so this in an overwhelmingly large number of countries, mortality revolution was earlier than, so the mortality revolution was earlier than the fertility revolution. Okay, for this reason, if you look at the very long run history, so for instance, if you want to look at this for England or Western Europe more generally, so there could be some transitions, but that episode would be roughly 1875, all right, or let's say mid 1800s, okay? And about here, let's say this is 2000s. So if you look at the Western Europe and England and some other countries, you see something like that. And typically the fertility measure in richer countries are now less than 2. Okay, so TFR is less than 2, so that's very rough, of course. There could be other countries. In some countries, it is actually as low as, let's say, 1.5 kids or 1.3 kids. Okay. So I'm not really that familiar with that most recent statistics, but there are some tables in several textbooks, and you can find detailed data in the United Nations population projections. But what we need to do, of course, is to understand why there is that particular shape in fertility and why there is that particular shape in mortality. Okay? So let me now proceed to causes of the mortality transition. Okay? Now, typically, we have 3 causes. Okay, so in most, so the general agreement in the literature is that there are three causes. One is improvements in the standard of living. Okay. When I say standard of living, I say higher income, better food, better and more abundant food, improved, so access, access to shelter, etc., etc. Okay, so in general, when we look at economic history of today's developed countries, we observe that when the standard of living is getting improved, when incomes are getting slightly larger, real incomes, of course, when people have access to better and more abundant food, highly nutritious foods, etc., the mortality rates decrease. Okay, so that's one reason. The other reason is public health measures. Okay, so these public health measures, of course, are related with, after the, let's say, 18th century, especially after the 18th century, in many countries, national governments, they created reforms in many aspects of life, right? So one particular example is, of course, the unification of Germany, for instance, right? So Otto von Bismarck created such stuff. Same is true for actually, after the French Revolution, the French Republic also realized, also French public realized, so with better measures in terms of cleaning, in terms of urban services, etc. So there could be public health measures from let's say urban services, cleaning, water and sanitation, and other stuff. Okay, so those public health measures, when they get improved, when they better serve humanity, mortality rates decrease as well. And finally, which is also very important, is advances in medicine. I mean, this is obvious. So, you know, starting with, let's say, germ theory, right? There could be. I mean, we could list many different advances in medicine. Most importantly, I believe the invention of penicillin today and other antibiotics today, they save a lot of people, right? So people survive thanks to antibiotics. Mm-hmm. So these three causes explain almost all of the variation in mortality rates in the very long run. Okay, we may associate these with each other as well. Okay, so it is possible, right? So you get richer, you spend more resources into the health sector and, you know, medical research. Then of course you have advances in medicine, or when you get, you know, public health measures in place, that also increases, you know, people's livings. Then people become more productive and they improve their standard of living, etc. So there could be certain linkages between them, and we're going to cover some of these in the next week when we talk about human capital. Okay, so next week we're gonna discuss some of these interlinkages. But for now, these three are you know, I mean, that discussion is sufficient for us, adequate for us. Okay, so that's the mortality part. What about the fertility part? The causes of fertility transition or fertility revolution. Now, interestingly, one of the reasons is the mortality transition as well. Why? Let's try to understand that. Most of the time, economists assume that people value children. Okay, so as if, you know, we like cookies, as if we like, I don't know, a nice steak dinner, we also like to have kids. Okay, so there is of course a biological side to it, right? We are living organisms, we are biological creatures, and one of our fundamental, let's say, incentives or fundamental motives, let's say, is to have kids, right? Because we want to transfer our genes to the next generation, and as a species, as members of Homo sapiens sapiens, we want to survive. Okay, and for this, we want to have kids. If we want to have kids, you know, the revealed preference theory tells us that, okay, then we must be valuing kids, right? But when we think of this, we quickly realize it is not the total number of births, right? It is not the total number of births a woman would attain that gives us utility. It must be the number of surviving kids. Okay. Now imagine you're living in a country, or you are living in a period where mortality is too high. All right. Let's say child mortality is too high. So if two babies are born, the probability that one of them survives to adulthood is just 1/2. Right. So on average, if this, you know, 1/2 probability applies to any kid, all right, any kid you're gonna have, you know, you're gonna bring to this world, and then if you want 2 kids, on average, you must have at least 4 births, right? Because there's high likelihood that 2 of them will survive. Okay, so if you want 2 kids for your family, and the child mortality rate is 1/2, Well, on average, again, you must have 4 kids. If you want 3 kids, on average, you must have 6 kids, right? For this reason, for this very reason, mortality transition itself is an important determinant of the fertility transition, okay? And this is the, this is demographers' favorite explanation for the fertility transition, actually. So once again, remember, mortality transition started earlier, right? So that was mortality, that was fertility. So here, according to this theory, fertility started decreasing because mortality decreased, right? So people realized, okay, I have 2 kids, and my ideal number of surviving kids is 3, and now mortality is getting decreasing and decreasing. So maybe if I have 1 more birth, then that would be enough, right? Because the kid will survive. So that was one reason. And again, this is the most popular reason among demographers, okay? Now, economists put forward 3 other explanations, okay? 3 other explanations. Now, one is the interaction of income and substitution effects. I'm going to explain in a moment. Okay? The other is resource transfers from children to adults or parents, right? And the other is the famous quality-quantity trade-off. Okay, quality-quantity trade-off. So I'm going to explain each of them in return, but I'm going to leave that to the second session of today. Let me now pause for a moment, and if you have questions, I can answer them, or if you have comments, I can respond to them.
Hocam sıkıntı değilse tekrar açabilir misiniz? Bana çok geriden düşüyor da çok takip edemedim.
Tamam.
Teşekkür ederim.
Any questions? Okay, then after the break, I'm going to discuss these, reason 2, reason 3, reason 4, and they're gonna show us, according to these economic reasons, because of these economic reasons, we today understand why large incomes, economies becoming more prosperous, will have lower fertility, right? Because today, if you look at the data, rich countries all have very low fertility levels, okay? So I'm going to explain these reasons after the break. Time is now almost 1:40, so let's meet at 1:55. And at 1:55, we're going to continue with these economic reasons behind the fertility transition, okay? I'm now ending the session, and see you in 1:55. Bye-bye.